I first noticed the towers while standing on a riverbank in Central Europe, watching commuters cross a bridge that had carried traffic for centuries without anyone questioning its anatomy. The stone rose from the water in thick, squared columns, heavy with ornament, and cut from blocks too large to feel ornamental. What unsettled me was not their mass, but where that mass began. Decorative foundations are usually shallow, symbolic gestures meant to impress. These towers were not. Their carved bases vanished straight into the embankment, swallowed by soil and pavement, as though the river itself had been raised around them. I began photographing joints in the masonry, tracing mortar seams where one era of stone ended, and another had been laid over it. Lower courses bore weathering inconsistent with burial, edges softened by wind, not damp, tool marks dulled by centuries of exposure, not sealed underground. Municipal plaques credited restorations, but never initial construction depths. Architectural registries listed the towers as substructures, yet their proportions suggested something once fully exposed, meant to be seen and entered rather than entombed. The deeper I looked, the more institutional fingerprints appeared without signatures. Survey reports referenced reinforcement. Renovation permits spoke of stabilizing lower sections. No one explained why those lower sections existed at all. The bridge authorities, the city archives, the engineering firms inherited the stone and continued using it, as though its submerged bulk were natural, inevitable, beyond curiosity. I left the river with an uneasy certainty forming beneath restraint. Whatever lay under those walkways had not always been underground, and if the burial was not decorative, not accidental, then the streets above were not where the story began. The unease from the riverbank followed me into archives and municipal engineering offices where the language was colder, cleaner, and far more revealing than the stone itself. I requested renovation drawings, load-bearing assessments, drainage upgrades. What I kept finding were cross-sections that sank deeper than any decorative footing should. Lines labeled original grade hovered meters below current streets, buried under successive layers of paving, fill, and resurfacing campaigns that spanned only a handful of decades. Surveyors had recorded these depths without commentary. Engineers had recalculated stress loads as if it were normal for towers to begin halfway underground. Reinforcement schedules assumed that lower floors had always been basements. Yet when I compared those diagrams to early floor plans, the contradiction sharpened. Doorways appeared where soil now pressed against stone, windows aligned with nothing but earth. Staircases descended into blank rectangles that modern maps pretended had never existed. I reached out to infrastructure departments and restoration committees. The replies were polite, procedural, hollow, settling. One email suggested urban growth, another historical layering, a third. None explained why the same layering appeared in city after city along rivers separated by borders and centuries of political difference. When I pinned the data to a map, clusters emerged along major waterways, trade routes, and transport corridors. The proportions repeated, the burial depths repeated. Even the renovation timelines began to overlap. What I had assumed was a local oddity now looked disturbingly consistent. If one bridge tower had been swallowed by shifting streets, it could be dismissed. If dozens had, scattered across regions, then the measurements were not misbehaving at all. They were telling the same story everywhere. The measurements drove me backward in time. If the stone had once stood higher, then older records should have remembered it that way. I began with atlases kept in regional libraries, oversized volumes whose pages creaked when opened, city grids etched in pale ink, long before asphalt and tram lines settled into permanence. Early bridge renderings showed towers rising cleanly from riverbanks, their lowest arches exposed to air rather than earth. Municipal plans from the same decades placed roadways far below today's traffic lanes, drawn with a confidence that assumed those levels would endure. Photographs confirmed what the maps implied. Faded prints captured pedestrians moving beneath arches now half sealed by embankments. Horse carts rolled across approaches that no longer exist. I compared dates, stamped in margins, penciled corrections in planning offices, annotations in survey books written by hands long gone, renovations, reroutings, improvements. The language was calm, bureaucratic, but the timing was not. Whole districts were raised within the same narrow window of years, not city by city, over generations. Everywhere, at once. Archivists appeared only through their decisions, files preserved, others thinned. Some folders ended abruptly, mid-project, replaced by new schematics that treated altered streets as original conditions. Urban planners inherited those revisions and built on them, never pausing to reconcile what the paper beneath their desks contradicted. I spread the maps across a table, layering centuries of streets until patterns emerged through transparency. Old ground levels aligned, new ones hovered above them in parallel bands. The stone had not sunk. The cities had risen. The map suggested vertical change, but the streets confirmed it. I walked to avenues whose storefronts opened at shoulder height, where iron grates guarded what had once been windows, now pressed flush against soil. Stone lintels hovered inches above pavement, decorative on the surface, structural beneath, relics of doors that no longer existed. Municipal resurfacing logs recorded layer after layer of FAR. Each one thin by itself, meaningless in isolation, yet overwhelming when stacked across decades. Public works departments described the process with practiced neutrality: flood mitigation, drainage upgrades, traffic management. Construction crews appeared only through invoices and permits, anonymous hands raising curbs, pouring new roadbeds, sealing old thresholds without asking why those thresholds were there in the first place. Each intervention treated buried entrances as inconvenient leftovers, never as clues. Cross-sections from sewer replacements revealed staircases descending into sealed chambers, shop-front arches bricked over, their curvature still visible beneath stucco. Basement renovations exposed ornate masonry far below street level, carvings too careful for utility spaces, proportions that implied public access rather than storage. I compared renovation schedules city by city. The same decade surfaced again, the same aggressive elevation campaigns, the same assumption that the lower world belonged to the past and did not deserve explanation. Administrative narratives spoke of growth, adaptation, modernization. The stone spoke of interruption. If urban life had simply risen with prosperity, the layers would have told a gradual story. Instead, they compressed into narrow spans of time, as though entire districts had been forced upward in response to something sudden, something that made old streets unusable all at once. The possibilities settled quietly, heavier than any accusation. The buildings had not been sinking. Something had made the cities climb. By the time I reached geological reports, the pattern no longer felt architectural alone. Soil surveys taken during subway excavations and flood control projects revealed sediment layers that did not belong to slow urban growth, fine silts trapped between masonry courses, compact clays resting above paved streets, river deposits sitting where marketplaces once stood. Drainage assessments described emergency channels cut through fill, whose origin was never recorded, as though the ground itself had arrived without paperwork. Reconstruction budgets surged in the same narrow windows of time. Entire districts resurfaced, leveled, rebuilt, on top of foundations the planners quietly abandoned rather than excavated. Engineering memoranda referenced subsurface instability. City councils authorized rapid elevation projects. No ledger described what caused the instability in the first place. I laid timelines beside rainfall records, river heights, quarry shipments, landfill contracts. The dates aligned too cleanly. Municipalities separated by borders responded with the same construction strategies within. The same decades, raising streets, sealing lower floors, rerouting drainage, as if following a script none of them had written. Coincidence began to lose its authority. Blocks vanished beneath fill. Basements became new ground floors. Public squares were recast over buried avenues, whose outlines still surfaced during maintenance work. The records did not describe an event. They described recovery, and recovery only makes sense when something has already happened. Once the sediment layers and rebuilding campaigns lined up, the buried bridge towers stopped looking isolated. I began cataloging other structures whose lower portions had been absorbed into the ground. Vaulted chambers beneath plazas, arched corridors sealed behind brick, decorative stonework hidden below storefronts, the same design language repeated across borders, monumental symmetry, oversized openings, masonry fitted with a precision that modern restorations struggled to replicate even with steel reinforcement and laser surveys. These forms appeared in cities long associated with Tartarian architecture, places where domes, pylons, and riverworks followed proportions that seemed excessive for ornament alone. Official registries credited later empires with their construction, yet those same registries grew vague when describing foundations. The deeper levels were treated as incidental, as if no one wished to account for what lay beneath the revised street lines. Institutional presence emerged only through omission. No dedicated excavation reports, no long-form studies of why infrastructure that once touched open air now sat meters underground. Renovation projects sealed chambers rather than reopen them. Preservation boards reinforced walls without questioning their original elevation. I overlaid photographs from different countries taken decades apart. In each, towers stood proud at river level, flanked by pedestrians and carts. In the modern era, the same towers appeared truncated, their lower thirds erased by embankments and roads. If these works were engineered to function at street height, then what we now call basements were never meant to be below ground at all. The question refused to stay quiet. What kind of society builds infrastructure so monumental that later generations bury it instead of explaining it? Once the architecture itself raised questions, I expected the paper trail to thicken. Major rebuilds normally generate decades of follow-up. Excavations demand reports. Geological anomalies invite committees. Academic disputes leave behind journals thick with footnotes and rebuttals. Here, the record thinned instead. Search results tapered off after reconstruction campaigns concluded. Municipal archives contained brief engineering summaries, then nothing. University catalogues listed studies on bridge aesthetics and traffic modernization, but none addressing why foundational levels had shifted so abruptly. Historical societies preserved postcards of riverfronts before the changes, yet never commented on what had vanished beneath later streets. The silence did not feel like censorship. It felt procedural. Each institution passed responsibility to the next. Preservation boards focused on visible facades. Urban historians concentrated on surface growth. Archaeological departments cited a lack of access to sealed lower levels. The absence became self-sustaining. In digitized newspaper collections, early reports spoke openly about unexpected masonry discovered during sewer replacements. A few years later, similar discoveries were reduced to single lines. After that, nothing at all. The stone endured, the paperwork dissolved. What troubled me most was how easily the buried layers slipped into normalcy. Basements were assumed to have always been basements. Reinforced walls were treated as routine upgrades. Entire substrata of cities became architectural background noise, accepted simply because enough time had passed. Knowledge did not have to be destroyed. It only had to stop being asked for. Once I widened the search beyond individual cities, the anomalies multiplied instead of fading. River crossings in Central Europe echoed those along northern trade routes. Harbor districts in the south showed identical layering patterns beneath plazas rebuilt in the same decades. Municipal reconstruction schedules, written in different languages and filed under different regimes, repeated the same sequence of actions: elevate the roadway, seal lower entrances, reroute drainage, reinforce foundations, move forward. I arranged timelines across a wall, each city reduced to dates and engineering notes, stripped of narrative. The alignment was uncomfortable. Independent administrations responding in isolation should have produced staggered solutions, uneven recoveries, conflicting approaches. Instead, The rhythms matched buried levels here, rebuilt streets there. The same brief spans of upheaval appearing hundreds of kilometers apart. Photographs from port towns showed arches that once opened directly onto quays. Inland capitals preserved engravings of promenades that no longer existed at their recorded heights. Renovation contracts from different countries referenced legacy structures without specifying when those legacies had been created. Individually, each case invited rationalization. Together, they resisted it. The towers, the sealed chambers, the redefined basements, the vanished streets were not scattered curiosities. They formed a continental signature, a coordinated architectural afterimage imprinted beneath modern life. Whatever had reshaped one city had not stopped there. It had crossed borders. By the time the pattern crossed borders, the investigation stopped being about stone alone. What mattered now were the functions those stones once served. Towers that looked ornamental today had clearly supported weight, arches sealed into basement walls, aligned with former road surfaces. Doorways submerged beneath pavement, connected to nothing at all. Something operational had been taken offline. In municipal renovation records, I kept encountering the same vocabulary: adaptation, conversion, stabilization, rarely restoration, rarely excavation. Older levels were not reopened. They were absorbed, reinforced, reassigned, new purposes that required no memory of what came before. Custodians inherited chambers without blueprints. Contractors poured concrete over corridors whose destinations no longer mattered. Office workers crossed floors suspended above hollow volumes they would never see. Generations occupied repurposed spaces without being told they were standing inside truncated systems. The silence around original design was not dramatic, it was bureaucratic. Once entrances were blocked and staircases removed, no official needed to explain why they had existed at all. The city functioned. Traffic flowed. Utilities worked. The question of former configurations became optional. That was what unsettled me. Urban resets did not only bury structures, they buried logic. If these towers had once risen fully into daylight, if basements had been streets and service chambers part of circulation networks, then something fundamental had been overwritten. Not destroyed, reinterpreted. I kept returning to a single thought as I compared floor plans from different centuries. How much of a city can be submerged before its original purpose becomes unknowable? And at what point does forgetting stop being accidental? I returned to the bridges where the investigation had begun, standing once more before towers that had been casually labeled foundations for so long that the word no longer sounded provisional. Their lower courses bore no signs of hurried reinforcement. The masonry was uniform, intentional, finished to the same standard as the sections rising above modern traffic. Drainage channels, cut through buried stonework, aligned with surfaces that no longer existed. Blocked apertures faced nothing but compacted fill. These were not emergency supports. They were former exteriors. Maps suggested one story. Renovation records implied another. Geological layers offered a third. None of them aligned completely, and no institution appeared eager to reconcile the gap. City authorities maintained present function. Preservation boards protected what could still be seen. Academic surveys stopped at sealed thresholds. Between them lay a zone that belonged fully to no discipline. I compared engravings, cross-sections, repair invoices, sediment reports. Each source felt reasonable in isolation. Together they formed a silhouette, shaped like something missing. The towers endured regardless of explanation. They held the weight of traffic, cables, weather, centuries. They also held the outline of a vanished surface, one that no longer fit the stories attached to it. If streets once ran where basements now collect moisture, if gateways opened where soil presses against stone, then Europe's cities were not merely rebuilt. They were overwritten. What else sits beneath plazas and avenues, accepted only because it no longer interrupts daily life? And how many layers of history become invisible simply by remaining in place long enough?